Uzziah ruled Judah for 52 years. That number alone carries weight. 52 years is not simply a reign, it is a generation. Children born in the first year of his kingship grew old under his shadow. The land shaped itself around his presence the way a river shapes the ground through which it flows, slowly and without announcement. His name became part of the ordinary rhythm of Judean life, woven into the background of daily experience the way mountains are woven into a landscape. And yet that ordinariness concealed something shifting inside him across those decades. Something the record of his life does not name in his early years, but eventually identifies with precision. The text of 2 Chronicles describes the arc of his reign with a sentence that holds everything inside it. When he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. The story of how a man arrives at that sentence is what deserves careful attention. His father was Amaziah, king of Judah, whose reign ended in failure and humiliation. Amaziah had started well enough. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, the text says, though not with a whole heart. After defeating the Edomites in battle, he brought back their gods and began to worship them, which the record treats as a serious abandonment of the covenant. A prophet came to him and asked why he would seek gods who had not delivered their own people. Amaziah refused to listen, and the prophet told him simply that God had determined to destroy him. His end came at the hands of conspirators. He fled to Lachish and was killed there. Into this inheritance, Uzziah stepped at the age of 16. The people of Judah took him and made him king in his father's place. That phrase, "the people took him," reflects something about the political moment. The kingdom was unstable. It needed a king quickly. A section of Jerusalem's wall had been torn open by the king of Israel during Amaziah's reign. The treasury had been plundered. The reputation of the royal house was damaged by the manner of his father's death. Uzziah was young, and he was inheriting something broken that needed rebuilding from the ground up, not merely maintaining. Whether the 16-year-old fully understood the weight of what had happened, the record does not say. What is clear is that he turned toward the Lord from the beginning. That turning was not a formality. It mattered. It held for a long time. The second book of Chronicles introduces a man named Zechariah, described as one who understood the visions of God. He wrote no book. His name is attached to no famous event. But the text connects him to Uzziah's early years in a specific way. As long as Uzziah sought the Lord, God made him prosper. And Zechariah, the text implies, was part of how that seeking happened. He instructed the king. He gave him direction. He was not a ceremonial figure standing at the edge of the court for appearances. He was someone whose counsel shaped decisions. There is something easy to pass over in this arrangement. Uzziah was not simply a man who prayed privately and then acted on his own understanding. He was a man who sought guidance from someone who could perceive things he could not. Zechariah's presence represents accountability in the deepest sense. A relationship in which Uzziah was still willing to listen, still willing to receive correction, still humble enough to acknowledge that his own perspective was not complete. That posture of receptiveness was the condition under which everything else in his early reign worked. The text does not describe the conversations between them in detail. We do not know how often they met, what questions Uzziah brought to him, or what specific guidance came from those meetings. But the structure of the narrative makes the relationship's importance unmistakable here. Uzziah fought. He fought the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod. And he built cities in the territory around Ashdod and in Philistine country. He fought the Arabians who lived in Gur-Baal and against the Munites. The Ammonites paid tribute to him. His fame spread even toward Egypt, because his strength continued to grow. This was not ceremonial strength. It was military capability built through organization, discipline, and actual combat. The text describes his army in careful terms. There were chiefs who commanded large units. An officer named Hananiah was among his commanders. The fighting force was counted and structured. The total recorded in the text exceeds 300,000 trained men. Uzziah equipped them with shields, spears, helmets, armor, bows, and stones for slinging. That level of preparation speaks to sustained effort across many years, not a single campaign. He also invested in military technology that appears to have been unusual for his time. The text describes engines of war, placed on the towers and corners of Jerusalem to shoot arrows and hurl large stones. The exact nature of these machines is not described in enough detail to reconstruct them with certainty, and scholars have debated what they may have resembled. But the point is clear. Uzziah was not maintaining defenses that already existed. He was building new ones. Jerusalem itself was reinforced under his watch. He built towers at the corner gate, the valley gate, and at the angle. He strengthened the walls of the city. Outside Jerusalem, he built towers in the wilderness and dug many cisterns to support large herds in the lowland pastures. And the text adds something personal. He loved the soil. He had farmers and vine dressers working the hills and the fertile lands. Consider what 52 years of sustained achievement does to a person. Not from a distance, but from inside it. Each year builds on the last. The victories accumulate. The walls go up. The harvests come in. The armies hold the borders. Tribute arrives from neighboring peoples. Year after year, decision after decision, the outcomes confirm the soundness of the king's judgment. The world responds to his choices by producing results that justify those choices. That kind of sustained feedback does something to a man's perception of himself. It does not happen suddenly. There is no clear moment when pride arrives. It builds the way sediment builds in a river. Layer by layer, each deposit small, the accumulation slow. Every successful campaign adds another layer. Every fortification that holds adds another. Every harvest from the fields he loved adds another. And with each layer, the distinction between what the king has achieved through his own effort and what has been given to him through grace becomes slightly harder to see clearly. The text does not analyze this process. It does not track Uzziah's development year by year. It simply names the result. When he was strong, his heart was lifted up. Something that was meant to stay at a certain level rose above it, without announcement, without a single decisive moment. A shift was occurring in how Uzziah understood his own standing before God and before men. This was not simple ingratitude or a sudden forgetting of God. Uzziah had not abandoned worship. He had not turned to foreign gods as his father had. The forms of his religious life continued. What was changing was something more specific. It had to do with the boundaries of his authority, with what he believed he was permitted to do, with how thoroughly he had begun to identify his own will with divine sanction. The office of king in Israel was a bounded office. The king held real authority. He commanded armies, administered justice, directed the economy, represented the nation in its dealings with foreign powers. His role was substantial and his power was genuine. But it did not extend everywhere. Certain domains were set apart by covenant and law, maintained by a separate institution with its own calling, its own lineage, and its own responsibilities. The priesthood was not a department of the royal administration. It was a distinct institution with its own line of consecration going back through Aaron to God's specific instruction at Sinai. The priests served in the temple, maintained its rituals, offered its sacrifices, and burned incense on the altar of incense. These functions were not theirs because the king had delegated them. They were theirs because God had established them as such. The separation between king and priest was not tradition or preference. It was structural to the covenant itself. Uzziah knew this. He had grown up knowing this. Every educated member of his court knew it. The line between royal authority and priestly authority was not obscure or ambiguous. It was written down and had been maintained for centuries. And yet, Uzziah made a decision. He entered the temple of the Lord and prepared to burn incense on the altar of incense. That act belonged to the priests and to the priests alone. A king crossing into that function was not exploring a gray area. It was a direct transgression of a clear boundary. Why he made this decision is something the text does not explain. It records the act and its consequences, but does not narrate the reasoning that preceded it. We are not told he was angry with the priests about something, or that he had decided the religious system needed reform, or that he was testing a boundary. The text says simply that he went in. The decision itself is the fact the record preserves. It is consistent with the narrative to understand that this decision did not arise from nowhere. After decades of commanding armies, directing engineers, shaping the agricultural and military landscape of an entire nation, making decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives, there may have been a steady erosion of the sense that any domain was genuinely off limits to him, not because he had become openly lawless, but because sustained power, when it goes unexamined, tends to expand its own sense of what it is entitled to reach. The record does not state this explicitly, but it fits the shape of what the text does tell us. Azariah the priest went in after him. He was not alone. 80 priests followed him into the temple and stood before the king. They told him what he was doing was wrong. They said it plainly. "You have done wrong, Uzziah. It is not for you to burn incense to the Lord. That belongs to the sons of Aaron, who have been consecrated for this work. Go out from the sanctuary, for you have done wrong. You shall have no honor from the Lord God." This confrontation required courage. As king of Judah, he had armies at his command. His authority over the lives of these men was absolute in ordinary political terms. To walk in behind him and tell him directly, in that place, that he had done something wrong was not a small act. But they went in, and they spoke clearly. Uzziah's response was anger. The text says he was angry with the priests, and in that moment, his hand still held the censer. He did not put it down. He did not step back. He held it and became angry. That combination, the rising anger and the censer still in his hand, describes a man who experienced the priest's correction not as a warning to receive, but as a challenge to his authority. The anger reveals what had been forming in him through all those long years of unquestioned success. He had arrived at the conviction that his standing before God was simply different from that of other men, that what applied to them did not fully apply to him. While his anger was still rising, while his face was flushed and his hand held the censer and the priests stood before him, leprosy appeared on his forehead. The text describes this without pausing. It happened while Uzziah was angry with the priests. In the presence of the priests, in the house of the Lord, the disease appeared on his forehead. The priest saw it and hurried him out from there. He himself also hastened to leave, because the Lord had struck him. That last phrase deserves attention. He hurried to go out. The man who moments earlier had been standing his ground against 80 priests, holding the censer, responding to their words with anger rather than reflection, now moved quickly to leave. What changed in that moment is not described in the text. Whether it was terror or a sudden return of awareness or something beyond both, we do not know. But the speed of his departure stands in sharp contrast to the stubbornness of the moments before it. The leprosy did what the priest's words had not done. It made him leave. There is no recorded speech here, no recorded prayer, no scene of weeping or confession at the gate of the temple. Uzziah hurried out, and the text moves on. The leprosy that appeared on his forehead in that moment remained on him until the day he died. There is something in the timing that the text does not comment on, but that is worth noticing. The leprosy did not come during the days before or after Uzziah had returned to his house and reflected. It came while he was still angry, while he was still holding the censer. The judgment arrived inside the transgression itself at its most defiant moment. This is consistent with how the biblical text elsewhere describes divine response to willful violation. Not as a delayed penalty assessed later, but as something already present within the act of crossing the boundary. Being a leper in ancient Israel meant separation from the ordinary life of the community. The law of Moses was precise about this. A person with leprosy was examined by priests, declared unclean if the condition was confirmed, and required to live outside the normal boundaries of communal life. The separation was not casual or informal. It was prescribed by law. For a king, the implications were specific and institutional. Uzziah lived in a separate house, excluded from the house of the Lord. His son Jotham was over the king's household, governing the people of the land. The man who had attempted to enter the most sacred space in Judah's religious life was now excluded from that space entirely. Not merely from the inner sanctuary where only priests could go, from the house of the Lord altogether. He could not enter as a worshiper. He could not take part in the regular assemblies of the people. That place was completely closed to him. He continued to live. He did not die immediately. But what remained of his life was a long isolation in a separate house in the city he had strengthened and rebuilt. Jotham administered the kingdom. The armies maintained the borders Uzziah had established. The towers he had built still stood at the corners of Jerusalem. The cisterns he had dug still held water. The farms he had loved were still being worked. All of this continued without him. The text does not describe what those years were like for Uzziah personally. Whether he watched the affairs of the kingdom from a distance, whether he communicated with his son, whether he spent those years in resignation or in some form of interior reckoning, none of this is recorded. With 4 words. In the year that king, with 4 words. In the year that King Uzziah died. And then Isaiah describes what came to him. He saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim attended the throne, and they called to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The doorposts shook at their voices, and the house was filled with smoke. The phrase "high and lifted up" used in Isaiah's vision carries the same weight as the phrase used to describe what happened to Uzziah's heart. His heart was lifted up. And then Isaiah sees the Lord himself, high and lifted up. The text does not draw this parallel explicitly. It does not pause to point it out. But it is present in the language, and its presence is not accidental in a tradition that chose its words with care. What Uzziah had reached toward in the temple, the encounter with holiness that he tried to access through an act of unauthorized priestly function, Isaiah receives as gift and experiences not as privilege, but as devastation. Not because God is erratic or impulsive, but because holiness of that order, complete, unborrowed, belonging entirely to itself, makes everything in a human being that has become inflated simply collapse. Isaiah says he is undone. He says his lips are unclean, a man of unclean lips living among a people of unclean lips, and his eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. A live coal from the altar touches his mouth. his guilt is taken away. He hears the voice of the Lord asking, "Who will go?" And he answers that he will go. The vision ends with a calling. What Uzziah had tried to seize, Isaiah receives through surrender. The difference between the two men in their encounters with the holiness of the temple is the difference between reaching and receiving. The biblical account does not describe Uzziah as having forgotten God. It does not say he stopped praying, or that he began to worship other things, or that his faith had grown cold in any obvious way. The corruption that brought him to the altar with a censer was not irreligion. It was a distortion of religion. He was performing a religious act. He was burning incense to the Lord. The transgression was not that he had ceased to honor God. It was that he had begun to decide, on his own authority, how that reverence would express itself, in a place and a form that had not been given to him. This distinction matters. It is possible for a person to remain within the outward forms of devotion and still cross the boundary between faith and presumption. The act looks like worship from the outside, but the inward reality is the assertion of the self into a space that belongs to someone else. Uzziah did not approach the altar as a man who had given up on God. He approached it as a man who had come to believe that God's restrictions did not really apply to him in the way they applied to others. 52 years had produced that conviction slowly, across a distance too long to see clearly from inside it. Uzziah's story moves differently from the stories of the more dramatically wicked kings of Israel and Judah. Those kings often appear in the record as corrupted early and openly. They introduce foreign gods, they murder prophets, they pursue open idolatry and violence against the covenant. The texture of their failure is loud and visible. Uzziah's failure is of a different kind. He was faithful for a long time. The early period of his reign was not performance. The text does not describe it as superficial obedience hiding a corrupt heart. He sought the Lord. He listened to Zechariah. He prospered because he sought God, and that relationship was not hollow. What happened over time was not a dramatic departure from faith, but a slow alteration in the way he held his own position before God. The moment in the temple was the moment when what had been forming inside him became external and visible. The pride, the sense of elevated standing, the belief that the boundaries which applied to other men did not fully apply to him, all of that crystallized into a single concrete act. He walked into the space reserved for priests and took up the censer. He was prepared to perform what had never been performed by a king of Judah. And when the priests confronted him with clear words, his response was not the response of a man whose heart was still oriented toward God as it had been in those early years. It was the response of a man who had arrived at a place where correction itself was experienced as an offense. That anger is not a minor detail. It is the full revelation of where the long accumulation of unchecked confidence had brought him. The priests were not wrong to speak. When the text records that Uzziah was buried with his fathers in a burial field that belonged to the kings, it adds the explanation. For they said he was a leper. He was buried near the royal tombs, but not in them. A field associated with the kings rather than the king's own burial place. The distinction is small enough that it could be overlooked. But it was recorded, and its being recorded means it was understood as significant. Even in death, the leprosy was the defining fact, not the 52 years of reign, not the military campaigns or the fortifications or the agricultural development or the machines of war. The men who buried him noted, as the reason for his placement, that he was a leper. The disease that appeared in the sanctuary on one day had defined every day that followed, and it followed him now into the way his burial was administered. The high places were not removed during Uzziah's reign. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on them. This is recorded alongside his achievements without explanation or excuse. The same long reign that built towers and strengthened walls and extended Judean military reach left untouched a persistent form of religious compromise. Strength in one domain does not automatically produce faithfulness in another. Uzziah's reign, like the man himself, contains things that do not cancel each other out. Jotham became king after him. The record of Jotham's reign is broadly positive. He became mighty, the text says, because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. That phrase, ordered his ways, implies deliberate attention to how his conduct before God was structured. The kind of watchfulness that his father had exercised early and then ceased to exercise as the decades of success removed the felt need for it. Uzziah died. The man who had ruled Judah for 52 years, who had rebuilt its defenses and extended its reach and loved its soil, who had stood in the temple with a censer in his hand and anger on his face, who had lived in a separate house with leprosy on his forehead from that day until his last, died and was buried in the field near the tombs of the kings. His story does not end with a resolution. There is no scene of restoration. There is no moment where the text signals that the leprosy was healed, or that Uzziah was reconciled to the temple he had been barred from, or that some late acknowledgement of what had happened brought his life to a completed arc. What the record leaves behind is a life that contains things that do not cancel each other out. The towers he built still stood after his death. The farms were still producing. The military organization he created continued to protect the borders. And the leprosy remained, defining the shape of his later years and the placement of his grave. Neither set of facts eliminates the other. A man can build and create and extend and love, and still be carrying inside himself something that distorts. Uzziah's early obedience was not a costume worn over a corrupt heart. The faithfulness of those early years was the actual Uzziah, seeking God under the guidance of Zechariah, governing carefully, winning battles he had no natural right to win, except that God prospered what he did. And then the long years of success began their slow work, not replacing faith with something else, something more difficult to name than that, making faith feel less necessary, making boundaries feel less binding, making the self feel larger than it actually was. He walked into the temple on a day when the distance between who he had been at 16 and who he had become across 52 years was finally made visible. The priests saw it before the leprosy appeared. They named it clearly. The anger that rose in him in response to their words is the measure of how far the distance had grown. A young king who sought the Lord because he needed to had become an old king who reached past the sacred because he no longer experienced himself as needing anything. The leprosy was not simply a penalty imposed from outside. It was the visible form of a condition that had already taken shape inside him over many years. What was in him came out on his forehead, and it stayed there until he died. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple, the same temple from which Uzziah had been driven in haste. The seraphim covered their faces, and a man who understood himself to be unworthy was touched by a coal from the altar and sent out to speak. He did not reach. He was reached toward. That difference between reaching and being reached toward runs through the whole account of Uzziah's long life and its particular ending. There is a question the story leaves open, and it is not really about Uzziah. It is about what happens when the calling placed on a life, the boundaries drawn around it, and the accountability once accepted as necessary and real begin to feel optional. Those conditions are not ancient. They do not belong only to kings. They belong to any life in which long success has had enough time to do its slow, quiet work without being examined. If this account has given you something to think about, leave a comment. What in Uzziah's story felt familiar? Subscribe if you want to stay with this kind of reading. And if this is the kind of conversation worth continuing, share it with someone who might sit with it too.